There's a deal happening right now that nobody is officially announcing. No press conference, no global headline, no single signed document that you can point to and say, there it is. But the evidence is everywhere if you know where to look. It is happening in arms factories deep inside the Saudi desert. It is happening inside data centers in Dammam, where Chinese artificial intelligence now runs on the servers of the world's largest oil company. It is happening in the waters of the Arabian Gulf, where Chinese and Saudi warships train side by side. And it is happening every single time a barrel of Saudi oil moves toward China, because that oil does not just power Chinese factories, it powers Chinese ambition. And right now, that ambition is military. This is not a story about two countries being friendly. Friendly is when you sign a trade agreement and take a photo. What is happening between Saudi Arabia and China is something far more calculated, far more strategic, and far more dangerous to the world order than a friendly handshake. This is a story about how the kingdom that literally built the American dollar's global dominance is now, quietly and deliberately, helping build the power of America's greatest rival. Not out of hatred for the West, not out of ideology, but out of something far more powerful than either of those things, out of survival. Out of a cold, hard, calculating decision made in the palaces of Riyadh that the world is changing, that the old protections are no longer reliable, and that the kingdom, which does not build new relationships today, will not survive tomorrow. And here's the part that makes this story unlike anything you have heard before. The country doing the most to help China's military rise is not North Korea. It is not Iran. It is not Russia. It is a country that has been America's closest Arab ally for over half a century. A country that has hosted American military bases on its soil. A country that has purchased hundreds of billions of dollars of American weapons. A country whose oil powered the American economic miracle of the late 20th century. Saudi Arabia is not America's enemy. That is what makes what is happening so extraordinary. That is what makes it so important to understand right now, before the world wakes up one morning and realizes that the balance of power has already shifted. Quietly, legally, commercially, and completely in the open, while everyone was looking somewhere else. To understand why Saudi Arabia is doing this, you have to go back further than most people think. And you have to understand what the old deal really was, not the diplomatic version, but the raw version. The version that was never written into any treaty, but was understood by every leader on both sides for 50 years. In 1973, the United States and Saudi Arabia made a deal that would reshape the entire modern world. America would protect the Saudi royal family. It would sell them weapons. It would guarantee their security, their borders, and their throne. In return, Saudi Arabia would do one thing and one thing only: price every single barrel of oil it sold to the world in US dollars. Not in gold, not in British pounds, not in German marks, in dollars. That deal created what the world came to call the petrodollar system. And that petrodollar is the reason the American economy became the undisputed center of global finance. Every country that needed oil needed dollars first. And to get dollars, they had to play by American rules. They had to hold American debt. They had to accept American terms. The entire architecture of American power, the ability to sanction, to pressure, to punish, to reward, rested on this one foundational deal. A deal made in the desert, a deal made with oil. For 50 years, Saudi Arabia played by those rules. They bought American jets, American missiles, American Patriot defense systems. They recycled their vast oil profits back into American Treasury bonds, pumping hundreds of billions of dollars back into the U.S. economy. They pressured OPEC to keep production levels favorable to Washington. They were, in every meaningful sense, the financial backbone of American global power. And in return, America kept its end of the deal. American forces stationed themselves across the Gulf. American aircraft carriers patrolled the waters near Saudi borders. American diplomats shielded the Saudi royal family from international criticism again and again and again through every controversy, every scandal, every human rights concern that the United Nations or the European press ever raised. But then something changed, and when it changed everything. It did not happen in a single moment. It was a slow accumulation of disappointments, a growing pile of grievances that Saudi leadership watched accumulate year after year, like water filling a reservoir that nobody in Washington thought to check. The United States looked the other way when Yemen descended into chaos on Saudi Arabia's southern border. The Houthi movement, armed and directed by Iran, turned southern Saudi Arabia into a war zone. Houthi missiles, Iranian-supplied and increasingly precise, hit Saudi oil facilities and caused billions in damage to Aramco infrastructure in the September 2019 attack on Abqaiq and Khurais, the largest attack on global oil infrastructure in modern history. American intelligence had tracked the preparation. American satellites had watched. And after the attack, the Trump administration did not respond militarily. It offered words. When Houthi missiles continued hitting Saudi cities and Saudi airports year after year, the Americans eventually pulled their most advanced Patriot missile defense batteries out of the kingdom and redeployed them to East Asia. read that again slowly, and let it land. When Saudi cities were physically under missile attack, America took its best missile shields away, not reduced, not temporarily repositioned, removed, sent to the other side of the world to protect against a threat America considered more important than Saudi Arabia's own cities. Washington also kept saying no every single time Saudi Arabia asked to buy advanced ballistic missiles. The Americans cited concerns about regional stability. They worried about proliferation. They worried about those missiles one day being fitted with unconventional warheads. But from Riyadh's perspective, these were just excuses. Saudi Arabia watched Iran develop its ballistic missile program with no equivalent American pressure on Tehran. Saudi Arabia watched Israel maintain its military edge with American support. And Saudi Arabia kept being told, not yet, not this, not for you. And then came the moral pressure. The human rights lectures from Washington think tanks and Senate committees, the congressional fury after the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi in October 2018 inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, the CIA's public assessment, released by the Biden administration in 2021, that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman himself approved the operation, the UN Special Rapporteur calling it a premeditated extrajudicial killing, the threats of arms embargoes from senators on both sides of the aisle, the public humiliation of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman on the international stage, with American officials debating whether he should be sanctioned, whether those responsible should be tried, whether Saudi Arabia should be isolated as a pariah state. Mohammed bin Salman, the man who is reshaping Saudi Arabia, who is dismantling the old religious establishment, who is building NEOM and massive gigaprojects and a bold post-oil economy, sat through years of this treatment from the country his kingdom had sustained financially for half a century. He watched America lecture him in public while privately continuing to cash Saudi investment checks and sell Saudi Arabia weapons. The hypocrisy was not lost on him. The resentment built. And he started asking a question that no Saudi leader had ever seriously asked before. What if we had another option? What if America needed us more than we needed America? China had been watching all of this very carefully, and China had its own powerful reasons to want Saudi Arabia's attention. China is the world's single largest importer of crude oil. Saudi Arabia is the world's largest oil exporter. Between 2021 and 2022 alone, bilateral trade between the two countries reached $3 billion. China now consumes more Saudi oil than any other nation on earth. Saudi Arabia supplies roughly 18% of all Chinese crude oil imports in a typical year. That is not simply a trade relationship. That is a strategic dependency. And Beijing understood very clearly that if it wanted to protect that oil supply for the long term, it needed to deepen its relationship with Riyadh far beyond simple commercial transactions. It needed to become something more than a customer. It needed to become a partner. And to become a partner in the way that mattered to Saudi Arabia right now, it needed to offer what America had repeatedly refused to give. So Beijing made its move, and it made it in the one area where Saudi Arabia was most frustrated, the military. Here is where the story gets very specific, very real, and very important to understand. Because what China offered Saudi Arabia was not simply a different supplier of weapons. What China offered was something America had deliberately withheld: access to ballistic missile technology, access to the very weapons that give a country genuine strategic deterrence, the weapons that make enemies think twice before striking, the weapons that Saudi Arabia had been asking for and being denied for years. Saudi Arabia's relationship with Chinese ballistic missiles goes back further than most people realize. As far back as 1988, Riyadh quietly purchased a batch of Chinese DF-3 intermediate-range ballistic missiles. Even at that time, the Reagan administration knew about it and, after some internal debate, accepted it as a fait accompli. Saudi Arabia upgraded those capabilities in 2007 with the purchase of the more modern Chinese DF-21 missile system, which has a range capable of reaching targets across the broader Middle East. But then in 2019, something far more significant was reported, something that crossed a threshold that earlier deals had not reached. According to analysis by the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, corroborated by satellite imagery assessment and multiple defense sources, Saudi Arabia began a program with Chinese assistance to produce ballistic missiles locally inside Saudi Arabia, using Chinese technology, Chinese equipment, and Chinese expertise working alongside Saudi engineers. Not purchasing finished weapons from China, actually building a domestic ballistic missile production capability on Saudi soil with Chinese help. Pause and think about exactly what that means. Saudi Arabia is not just a customer of Chinese military technology, it is becoming a co-producer of it. The factory is in Saudi Arabia, the workers are Saudi. But the knowledge, the specifications, the technical processes, those come from China. And every missile that rolls off that line represents Chinese defense industrial know-how embedded permanently inside Saudi Arabia's military infrastructure. This is technology transfer at the deepest level. And it is happening in a country that sits at the strategic heart of the world's most important energy-producing region. The missile cooperation is the most sensitive and secretive piece of this story, but it is far from the only piece. Between 2016 and 2020, China increased its total arms transfers to Saudi Arabia by nearly 400%, compared to the previous 5-year period. 400%. That is not an incremental trend. That is a deliberate, accelerating strategic shift happening in real time, clearly visible in the data. In 2017, Saudi Arabia purchased several Chinese Wing Loong 2 combat drones, sophisticated, laser-designated, weapons-capable, unmanned aerial vehicles that have been combat tested in conflicts across Libya, Ethiopia, and the UAE's various proxy wars. They work. They are lethal. And alongside that purchase, Saudi Arabia signed a memorandum of understanding with Beijing to manufacture an additional 300 of those same drones domestically inside Saudi Arabia. Not just buying, building, transferring technology, creating a local production line that gives the kingdom its own drone manufacturing capability. Then in 2022, during a period when the Biden administration was still publicly pressuring Riyadh over Khashoggi and threatening arms restrictions, Saudi Arabia signed approximately $4 billion in new arms deals with Chinese defense firms. These deals included a joint agreement to design and manufacture next-generation drones. $4 billion in a single round of deals. And at the Saudi World Defense Show in February 2024, China sent more than 30 defense companies under a single unified national banner called China Defense. 30 separate Chinese weapons manufacturers, all under one roof in Riyadh. That is not a business delegation. That is a military-industrial courtship. That is China telling Saudi Arabia, everything we make, you can have. And China brought something truly extraordinary to that 2024 show that had never been seen before outside of Chinese territory. They displayed the J-10 fighter jet's Bai aerobatic team, China's equivalent of the American Blue Angels, performing their full routine at a foreign air show for the very first time in history. And alongside that, they conducted an aerial refueling demonstration using the Y-20 strategic tanker aircraft over Saudi skies. Also the first time China had ever conducted a public overseas aerial refueling operation. Beijing was sending a very deliberate message, not just to Saudi Arabia, but to every defense minister and military planner in the watching world. Chinese military aviation has arrived. It is ready for the global stage, and the place it chose to make that historic international debut was the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. But the weapons and the missiles are only one layer of this story. The deeper layer, the one that causes the most anxiety among American intelligence analysts and policymakers, is technology. Specifically, the integration of Chinese technology into Saudi Arabia's most critical national infrastructure. Saudi Arabia's telecommunications network runs substantially on systems built by Huawei, the Chinese technology giant that the United States has spent years designating as a national security threat and trying to ban from allied nations' communications networks. When Washington banned Huawei from American 5G infrastructure and spent enormous diplomatic capital pressuring Britain, Germany, Australia, and other allies to follow suit, Saudi Arabia did no such thing. Huawei systems carry Saudi government communications. Huawei equipment is embedded in Saudi data infrastructure. And once Huawei is built into a country's telecommunications backbone, it is not simply unplugged. It becomes load-bearing. Every year it stays, it becomes more difficult and more costly to remove. Saudi Arabia is fully aware of this. The kingdom made a deliberate choice. Then there is artificial intelligence, the technology that every military strategist in the world right now identifies as the decisive factor in next-generation warfare. In February 2025, at the LEAP Technology Conference held in Riyadh, one of the world's most significant annual technology events, it was announced that DeepSeek, China's most powerful and internationally acclaimed artificial intelligence model, has been integrated into the data centers operated by Saudi Aramco Digital in Dammam, Saudi Arabia. Saudi Aramco is not merely an oil company. It is the financial engine of the entire Saudi state, responsible for approximately 70% of government revenue. It is one of the most data-rich organizations on the planet. Its operations span exploration, extraction, refining, logistics, pricing, and global energy trading. And now Chinese artificial intelligence is embedded inside those data centers, processing Aramco's operational workloads. Saudi Aramco's own chief technology officer publicly praised DeepSeek at the conference, describing it as a technology that brings fundamental changes to how computing resources are utilized and maximized. This was not a quiet pilot program. It was a public endorsement at a globally watched event. Saudi Arabia's sovereign venture capital arm also made a direct financial investment in Jipu AI, another major Chinese artificial intelligence company with documented links to Tsinghua University, which itself has deep ties to China's military research infrastructure. Saudi Arabia is not just using Chinese AI, it is funding its development. American officials from both the Biden and Trump administrations raised formal concerns about exactly this. A 2024 investigation by the New York Times found dozens of students from Chinese universities with documented institutional connections to China's military-industrial complex enrolled at the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, known as KAUST, which is Saudi Arabia's most advanced and most generously funded research institution. KAUST is the epicenter of Saudi Arabia's national push into artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biotechnology, and advanced materials. These were not ordinary exchange students on cultural programs. They were researchers, graduate students, and postdoctoral fellows from institutions that the United States government has specifically identified as having ties to the People's Liberation Army. They were working at the very frontier of Saudi Arabia's technological future. The Washington Institute for Near East Policy specifically recommended, in a published policy paper, that Washington formally request Riyadh remove Chinese personnel and assets from joint American-Saudi scientific projects, particularly at KAUST. One senior Saudi official reportedly signaled to American counterparts in 2024 that removal was possible if the U.S. formally asked. The formal ask has not come, and the Chinese researchers are still there. Now, here is where you need to understand the financial dimension of this story. Because none of the military cooperation, none of the technology integration, none of the strategic pivoting exists in isolation from the most important economic relationship between these two countries, oil and money. China and Saudi Arabia have entered into a $7 billion currency swap agreement, allowing the two nations to conduct bilateral trade directly in Chinese yuan and Saudi riyals, bypassing the US dollar entirely in those transactions. Saudi Arabia has been in active documented discussions, confirmed by reporting from the Wall Street Journal, S&P Global Commodity Insights, and multiple Gulf financial analysts, about pricing some of its oil sales to China in yuan rather than in dollars. This is called the petro-yuan. As of early 2025, Saudi Arabia is already using yuan settlement for at least a portion of its Chinese oil transactions. The exact proportion is not publicly disclosed, but the direction is unmistakable. Saudi Arabia's own Minister of Industry and Mineral Resources was asked directly about yuan-denominated oil settlements during a conference appearance in Hong Kong in September 2024. He did not deny it. He said the kingdom is open to new ideas and always willing to try new things, and that Saudi Arabia tries not to mix politics with commerce. That is the language of someone who is already doing something and does not want to stop. That is the language of a country that has already made a quiet decision and is simply waiting for the world to notice. Think about the deeper meaning of what the petro-yuan represents. The entire architecture of American financial power, the ability to sanction nations, freeze foreign assets held in dollars, cut adversaries off from the global banking system, rests fundamentally on the world needing US dollars to buy oil. If countries can buy Saudi oil in yuan, they need fewer dollars in reserve. If they need fewer dollars, America's ability to weaponize its currency diminishes. Slowly, incrementally, but it diminishes. China has understood this for over a decade. Saudi Arabia, which spent 50 years as the cornerstone of dollar dominance, now understands it too. And it is using that understanding with extraordinary strategic precision. In November 2023, Saudi Arabia was formally invited to join BRICS, the economic bloc co-led by China and Russia that explicitly positions itself as an alternative to the Western-led financial order dominated by the IMF, the World Bank, and the dollar system. Saudi Arabia's relationship with formal BRICS membership remained complicated through 2024, with reports of hesitation and conditions, reflecting the kingdom's characteristic desire to keep all doors open simultaneously. But the fact that the invitation was extended, accepted in principle, and publicly discussed sent a signal loud enough for every Treasury Department in the world to hear. Riyadh is at the table. Riyadh is thinking about it. Riyadh wants the option. Then came September 2025, and a development that reshuffled the entire strategic deck of the Middle East in a way that most Western media did not adequately cover. Saudi Arabia formalized a strategic mutual defense agreement with Pakistan, a country with an operational nuclear arsenal, and a country whose entire modern military capability runs on Chinese-built jet fighters, Chinese missiles, Chinese radar systems, and Chinese air defense platforms. Under the terms of this pact, Pakistan's nuclear deterrence now extends to cover Saudi Arabia. Let that sink in fully. The kingdom that spent 5 decades sheltering under the American military umbrella has now, for the first time in its modern history, placed itself under the nuclear protection of a country that is, in every practical military sense, a client state of China's defense industry. And here is what makes that development even more striking. Just months before that Pakistan-Saudi defense pact was finalized, something happened in the skies over South Asia that changed the way every military planner in the Gulf views Chinese weapons. In May 2025, during the brief but intense India-Pakistan military confrontation, Pakistan's Air Force, flying Chinese-built J-10C fighter jets, armed with Chinese-built PL-15E extended-range air-to-air missiles, is assessed by multiple defense analysts to have shot down several Indian warplanes. Those Indian aircraft included the Dassault Rafale, France's most advanced export fighter purchased at enormous cost by India's Air Force and widely considered one of the best combat jets in the world, alongside Russian-built Sukhoi Su-30 aircraft, elite, expensive, combat-proven platforms from Western and Russian manufacturers, downed by Chinese technology. The Singapore-based think tank RSIS stated it plainly in its published analysis. This air battle eliminated the primary credibility question that had always hung over Chinese weapons exports. Do they actually work under real combat pressure? The answer, observed by every defense ministry in the Gulf with their own analysts watching, was yes, they work. And Saudi Arabia, which had been steadily expanding its Chinese weapons purchases for years before this moment, now had battlefield confirmation. Now you might be sitting there thinking, but wait, Saudi Arabia just signed a $142 billion arms deal with the United States in May 2025, the largest single arms agreement in American history. So what does all of this China talk actually mean? Is Saudi Arabia really pivoting, or is this all being overstated? Here is the answer. And this is the most important thing to understand about Saudi Arabia's strategy, because it is the thing that makes the kingdom so difficult for Washington to manage. Saudi Arabia is not choosing China over America. Saudi Arabia is choosing both at the same time, deliberately, with full awareness of exactly what it is doing. The $142 billion American arms deal is real. The $4 billion Chinese arms deal is also real. The Patriot missiles coming from America are real. The Chinese ballistic missile factory inside Saudi Arabia is also real. The American F-35 discussions are real. The Chinese AI running inside Saudi Aramco's data centers is also real. All of it is happening simultaneously. And that is precisely the strategy. Saudi Arabia is not defecting from the American order. It is leveraging its position at the exact center of both great power systems to extract maximum benefit from both sides. It is using the China relationship as a permanent, credible bargaining chip to ensure America never again takes Riyadh for granted. Every time Washington lectures the kingdom about human rights, Saudi Arabia deepens a Chinese partnership. Every time the U.S. refuses a weapons request, Saudi Arabia signs a Chinese defense deal. Every time an American official threatens sanctions, Riyadh mentions the yuan. The message to Washington is clear. Even if it is never stated aloud, we have options. Treat us accordingly. And it is working with extraordinary effectiveness. The Biden administration fast-tracked multiple arms approvals for Saudi Arabia in direct response to the kingdom's China outreach. The Trump administration welcomed MBS to Washington with the full ceremony reserved for America's most valued allies. American officials have placed on the table a formal defense pact, civil nuclear cooperation, potentially helping Saudi Arabia develop its own nuclear energy program, and deep semiconductor and AI technology partnerships. All of it offered, all of it accelerated, because the U.S. is afraid of the alternative, and every concession America makes to keep Saudi Arabia inside its orbit is, functionally and strategically, a dividend that China collects, because China never had to do anything to earn those concessions. China just had to be available. China's strategy with Saudi Arabia is not aggressive. There are no Chinese military bases in the kingdom. There are no Chinese troops on Saudi soil. There are no formal alliance treaties. China's approach is patient, quiet, and incremental. It offers missiles without moral conditions, drones without human rights audits, artificial intelligence without political strings, oil settlement in yuan without requiring Saudi Arabia to abandon the dollar peg entirely, currency swaps without demanding exclusivity. And in doing so, China is building, piece by piece, deal by deal, technology transfer by technology transfer, a web of dependency and integration that does not look like a military alliance from the outside, but functions like one from the inside. There's also a geographic reality that is easy to overlook, but impossible to overstate once you see it. Saudi Arabia sits directly beside the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly 20% of the world's total oil supply passes every single day. Every tanker coming from Kuwait, Iraq, Iran, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia's own eastern terminals has to squeeze through that channel. The country that has influence over that strait has influence over the global economy. China is the world's single largest importer of the oil that moves through those waters. If Saudi Arabia becomes more deeply integrated into China's military and economic architecture, if Riyadh's decision makers are increasingly bound to Beijing by arms deals, technology partnerships, currency arrangements, and defense pacts, then Chinese strategic interests are now effectively embedded at the world's single most important energy choke point. Without one Chinese soldier stationed there, without one Chinese naval base built on Saudi soil, just through the patient, relentless accumulation of relationships, obligations, and shared interests. The Chinese university researchers at KAUST are in New York Times investigations. The naval exercises are in official Saudi and Chinese military press releases. There is no vault. There is no back channel that journalists haven't found. The information exists. It is published. It is available. The only secret is that the world has not yet fully decided what it means. And by the time the world decides, by the time Washington, Brussels, and Tokyo reach a consensus about how to respond, the factories will have built more missiles, the AI will have run on more servers, the yuan will have settled more oil barrels, and the web of dependency will be deeper, tighter, and far more difficult to unwind than it is today. When the kingdom that built the petrodollar starts building Chinese missiles on its own soil, running Chinese AI inside its national oil company, settling oil sales in Chinese yuan, and sheltering under a Chinese-armed nuclear umbrella, the world has already changed. The old order is already shifting. The agreements that held the post-Cold War balance in place are already loosening. And the country at the center of all of it is not a rogue state. It is not a declared adversary. It is America's most important Arab partner, a kingdom sitting on the world's largest proven oil reserves, controlling the Strait of Hormuz, hosting American military assets, and buying American weapons by the hundreds of billions. Saudi Arabia is not leaving the American system. It is building a door, and the key to that door is Chinese. We are just still catching up to the fact.